Today's video is sponsored by Output. More on that in a bit. So here's the initial idea. And this is where we get problems. Even though this arrangement is nice, the problem is that we're not changing the chords. And over time, this can lead to really repetitive sounding music. So we're gonna go over some ways that you can actually adjust chord progressions really easily and some of the more advanced methods for changing your chords through a piece. So first, let's break this down. We're in C minor. And in C minor, we have the following chords: C minor, D half diminished, E flat major, F minor, G minor, A flat major, B flat major, and C minor. And we could call these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Whether we're in major and minor, calling it that is really helpful because the chord progressions will move if we modulate. And so it keeps the chord progressions themselves locked in. So C minor, going to A flat major, which is 6. Going to B flat major, which is 7. Going to E flat major, which is 3. So we've got 1, 6, 7, 3. Now, the very first thing we could do to make this more interesting is actually to use inversions. And I've talked about inversions in the bass video if you watch that, but just to give you a quick recap, we're actually taking the bass note of any chord and we're starting on a different bass note. So if we're in C minor, C, E flat, G, we could instead start on E flat and go E flat, G, C. We're changing the order of the notes in that chord to get a new inversion. This is a whole separate subject, so I recommend looking this up if you're not familiar. But this is a very easy way to add a little bit more interest. So we could do something like this. Or we could do this. These are all inverted versions of the same chord progression. It feels more interesting because we're changing the voice leading that's happening within the chord. So we could do something like this. Already so much more interesting because we're just changing the inversions underneath. That's a very straightforward, simple way to do it, but it's only going to last you so long, so you need more tools in the toolkit. The next thing you could actually use is relative major and minor chords. If you're not familiar what those are, very briefly, for every chord that we have, whether it's major or minor, we have a relative major or minor. For example, C major has a relative minor chord of A minor. And if we're in a major chord, the relative minor is going to be 3 half steps down. And if we're in a minor chord, the relative major will be 3 half steps up. So C major has a relative minor of A minor. We go 1, 2, 3. What this means is that this major chord and this minor chord actually share 2 notes. C major and A minor both share C and E. Because of that, they're almost interchangeable. We could actually exchange these chords with relative majors or minors to be able to get a very similar sounding chord progression without having it be exactly the same. So if we take a look at this chord progression again, we're in C minor, and we go C minor, A flat major, B flat major, E flat major. Now I'll do the math for you. You can look this up more on your own, but the relative majors and minors of these would be E flat major for C minor, F minor for A flat major, G minor for B flat major, and then C minor for E flat major. So just by using relative majors and minors, we can actually change the chord progression to be E flat major, F minor, G minor, C minor. Now listen to how this influences the sound of the chord progression. Sort of sounds like a slightly darker version of what we had originally, right? Now, we wouldn't want to replace every single chord all the time, but we can replace them periodically to add a little bit of interest. So if we're working in this original chord progression and we do... maybe the next time we replace one of the chords. There's our F minor instead of A flat major. And there's our G minor instead of B flat. So we could replace them periodically for a bit more interest. Replace, replace, back to the original, inversion, replace. So now we're mixing up these tools for more interest. Now the next two techniques are a little bit more challenging, but before we get into that, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Arcade by Output. This is Arcade. It's huge. It is a very powerful engine with over 65,000 sounds, a built-in effects rack, custom sampler engine, and tons of playable instruments. As a media composer, we often have to do genres that we're not totally comfortable with, switching very quickly on the fly and needing to get things out very fast. Arcade is great for this. It has a great search engine where you can look by sample, instruments, search by instrumentation or genre. You can look for different lines, and you can even play to sample each of these one by one. I've only just started exploring this, but some of my favorite patches so far are the 7 congas, 8 bongos. I also really like the instead of hi-hats pack. It's alternative sounds for hi-hat instrumentation. And most of you don't know this, but I'm really into lo-fi music, and this downtime has some really, really cool sounds. And that's literally just scratching the surface. Now, if you're interested, you can try Arcade free for 30 days using the link in the description. And if you do like it, you can take an extra 50% off of your first month. Thanks again, Output. Arcade is awesome. And now back to the video. The next technique we'll talk about, which is a bit more challenging, is going to be using borrowed chords. Now, borrowed chords are what they sound like. They're taking a chord that's outside of our original key signature and using it for some color. To find these borrowed chords, one of the easiest things you can do is look within the note of your melody and look for alternative chords that don't exist in the key that you're in. So if we're in C minor, for example, and our first melody note is an E flat, think of all the chords that could contain an E flat. There are a ton of chords. We've got C minor, but we also have B major. We have A flat major, but we also have A flat minor. We have E flat major, but we also have E flat minor. Now that opens up a ton of new options for our chord progression. We could incorporate these borrowed chords in lots of interesting ways. Or we could do something like this. Now, borrowed chords, you have to be careful because the more you borrow, the farther outside of the key you're going to feel. So you don't want to use this all the time. It's something you want to use for a little bit of surprise. Now, fusing this idea with inversions and relative major and minors, we could wind up with something like this. So there's lots of interest that's happening. It's starting to expand in terms of what's possible. Finally, the last thing we're going to touch on is chord extensions. Now, this is similar to borrowed chords. We're going to be reharmonizing the melody itself, but we're going to actually expand the amount of chords that we could use. If you remember that example where I talked about all the options with an E flat, well, I kind of lied to you because there's even more options. This is assuming that we're talking about E flat as a root, a third, or a fifth of any of these chords. So C minor, E flat is the third, the fifth, or the root. But what if instead of just using roots, fifths, and thirds, we actually used 7th chords, 9th chords, 11ths, and 13ths? We could take this C, for example. We could harmonize this as F major, where C is the 5th, but we could also make C the 7th. D, dominant 7, where C is a 7. We could also make C the 9th. We could also make C the 11th. And finally, we could make C the 13th. Now, this is treading into some ambitious waters. Again, not something that you want to overdo, but it enables us to create some really interesting chord alternatives. If we explore that original progression, let's see how we can alternate that. C minor could become F7. This is our borrowed chord. There's some interesting chords. C7. Now this might inspire new ideas for you. Maybe you decide you want to actually take the C7 to modulate. And this is the idea, because when we're limited to our chord progression, it doesn't just stifle the chords, it actually stifles our creativity. The longer we loop, the harder it is for us to break out of that loop. But if we can think of chord progressions as things that can constantly expand and vary, then it creates new ideas for new chord progressions. So altogether, we can use these ideas to inspire other ideas. Now I'm going to try and put it all together in a little improvisation for you, and if you enjoy this, you can leave a like, subscribe for more, and I try and do these educational videos every couple of weeks. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one.